Absolute Bane's origin story has finally been revealed in the newest issue of Absolute Batman.
Let's break it down.
We now have a way better understanding of just how big of a threat Bruce is dealing with when it comes to Bane. I know that every single one of us already knows that he's an absolute monster because of what we've seen in the past couple issues, but what he had to go through and what he had to do to become that monster is just next level. So with that being said, if you don't remember, the last issue consisted of Bruce being broken in more ways than you could count on all your fingers, because not only was he stripped of all his clothes and then locked away in complete isolation, but every time he attempted to escape Arkham, he was forced to bear witness to the horrifying human experiments inside until Bane eventually discovered where he was hiding and beat him until he wasn't conscious, which after a while allowed the doctors to experiment on Bruce himself, leading him to such a broken and distraught state of mind that he was fully convinced that he wasn't capable of carrying forward. However, after Bane distributed all of his gear inside of his prison cell to draw him out for one last fight, Bruce finally managed to escape the facility successfully thanks to Killer Croc aiding him in battle when it seemed like all hope was lost. This issue, on the other hand, starts off with Alfred making an entry into his journal in the midst of Bane hunting down Bruce and Wayland after arriving to Gotham City. It's here that Alfred articulates feeling guilty about Bruce's current predicament, expressing that he might have had a better idea of what to expect out of Bane and Arkham if he told him about Bane's origin. After that, the story takes us right to the very beginning, where Bane was born in the midst of chaos during a war on an island called Santa Prisca. So it turns out that Bane's father was the leader of a rebel group called Cielos Libres, who had been fighting for Santa Prisca's freedom for more than 100 years. And the reason that the island was always at war was because it was rich in a bunch of rare compounds that different groups from around the world were interested in. Nevertheless, the flag that represented the group displayed Santa Prisca's national bird, the royal quetzal, and Bane's father believed in what the bird stood for so much that he would often see visions of the bird triumphantly flying free once their island was at peace. However, as the chaos of war pressed on, there was one night in particular where Bane ate a psychedelic jojoba seed in hopes of seeing the same vision that his father saw, but instead of seeing the quetzal, he described seeing a horrifying looking bird that was on fire with a skull in the middle of its back. Now, as Bane grew into an adult, he started overseeing and leading the rebels himself, and was so effective at doing so that his plans allowed them to take control of the island's capital. Unfortunately though, even though his father was sure that peace was right around the corner, soon enough they were overwhelmed by a group of foreign troops just 3 short days later. The surviving members of the Cielos Libres were then sentenced to life in a prison near Santa Prisca's coast, and the conditions were so horrible that they were forced to eat rats in order to sustain themselves, and because the tide would wash into all of the prison cells every night, Bane, along with everybody hoping to survive, was forced to learn how to sleep while hanging from cages to prevent themselves from dying in their sleep. Despite being exposed to such terrible circumstances though, Bane's father refused to let these conditions break his character and was still under the impression that the group would rise again one day. And even though some of the men would go on to betray him, he never really had to worry that much because Bane always dealt with their rebellious behavior. After that, the story speeds back over to present-day Gotham, where a group of militarized men were making sure nobody rebelled against the city curfew. Sooner than later though, one of the men noticed some movement in a nearby alleyway, so he flashed his light in the direction of the movement, stating that nobody was permitted to be outside. But just moments later, he would realize how big of a mistake this was when Bane wrapped his fist around his entire body before squashing him like a bug. And although it doesn't show every detail of what ended up happening next, we then see Bane calmly exiting the scene after taking down the entire squadron. After that, the issue switches things back over to the past in the middle of Bane and his fellow rebels escaping captivity after 11 long years of torture. And it's clear that Bane's mind was an extremely resourceful one, because despite not having access to any weapons at all, him and his men actually created some makeshift garrotes out of dried fish guts, which are pretty much weapons used for strangulation. And after taking control of the prison and its guards, they managed to blow up one of the walls to create an exit point with some of the guards' grenades. Bane and the Libres would then load up onto some nearby speedboats, where soon enough his father revealed that he had created a mask for Bane out of the group's flag itself because he couldn't help but be proud of the strong leader he had turned himself into, emphasizing that he was the Quetzal of Peace he had always seen in his visions. Nevertheless, as they crossed the bay heading towards Prisca's capital, all Bane could think about was the battle they'd soon be thrown back into. However, to Bane and the entire group's surprise, instead of being met by war, they were greeted by a man in a white suit ready to propose some sort of offer. And if you couldn't tell by the look of this white dude, yes, this is in fact the Jokety Joker. Now, there are a lot of buns on these next few scans, so I'm probably gonna have to blur them out so the video doesn't get taken down, and besides, you can goon on your own time, not mine. Anyways, the Joker ended up pulling Bane aside and making his offer in private, but unfortunately we don't get to hear what the offer is. A few moments later though, upon Bane walking away from the Joker, Bane's father was confidently under the impression that the reason Bane was walking away was because he declined the offer. So he went in for a hug, yet again incredibly proud that his son didn't cave into pressure, but moments later he realized that he couldn't have been any more wrong because Bane couldn't keep pretending like he still believed in his father's vision. He didn't want to be the Quetzal because that weak and pathetic bird failed him time and time again. He wanted to be the flaming bird of war that he saw in his own vision, believing that it was the only path that could lead Santa Prisca to peace. So in the midst of their hug, he began squeezing his father's back with such a massive amount of pressure that he died almost instantaneously. After that, we jump ahead into the near future where Bane is now carrying out various terrorist attacks while working full-time for the Joker. Joker. His first act of terror was blowing up a plane over a major city in China. Shortly after that, he went on to kill journalists and pirates for not minding their own business, and then he really made a statement by blowing up the Tower Bridge in London. And another important thing worth taking note of is that it was during this stage of life when he was turned into the monster as we know him today after going through multiple experimental surgeries. And Alfred believed that the venom he was constantly being pumped with after the surgeries was a combination of acids, proteins, compound activators, and these things called cytokines that your body uses as signals, giving him total control over every single one of his cells. But what's even crazier about the venom is the way that it enhanced his mind, because before there was only so much he could learn, but now he was capable of holding entire libraries of knowledge in his head, which is exactly why he knew every fighting style in existence. After that, the story jumps back over to present day, with Bane finally discovering where Bruce was taking refuge, and immediately upon breaking the lock on one of the facility doors, Bruce smashed his way outside through one of the nearby walls in hopes of catching him off guard. And as the two powerhouses stared each other down, we get yet another excerpt from Alfred, but this time he expresses how similar they were to each other, stating that he knew Bruce well enough to know he'd continue fighting no matter what, and he also knew he'd always have some sort of a plan roaming around in the back of his mind, just like the plans that Bane used to draw back when he was still a boy on Santa Prisca, a plan that was based on their greatest advantages, which was the knowledge of their homes. However, it only took a few short moments before Bane decided to jump into action and regain the upper hand by hurling such a massive piece of debris that Bruce went flying backwards into the air. Upon Bruce regaining his composure and getting back on his feet though, it's then revealed that taking the first blow was a part of a greater plan, because he wanted to get as far away from Bane as possible for the purpose of igniting a massive explosion. But despite being exposed to such an overwhelming blast, Bane was practically unaffected and just kept on advancing forward until battering Bruce on the ground again. But knowing that he had to keep on fighting if he wanted to live another day, Bruce then pulled off the battle axe from his chest, jamming it directly into Bane's shoulder in hopes of gaining control of the battle. However, unfortunately, Bane was not only unimpressed and yet again unaffected, but proceeded to effortlessly remove the axe from his body until lifting Bruce up into the air and slicing off one of his arms. And as Bruce screamed in agony while trying to crawl away with blood rapidly spilling out of his shoulder, Bane then took things a step even further by slicing off his other arm and then using the axe in the most brutal way possible by repeatedly slamming it into Bruce's face over and over again until his entire skull was crushed. After that, the story advances into the future, with Bane taking Bruce back over to Arc M, where the doctors inside the facility immediately prepared his body for surgery. Now, as stated by Alfred, the procedure that Bruce ended up going through was so brutal and extreme that most patients were incapable of surviving, because even when they did manage to survive the operation, their bodies always ended up giving out upon being exposed to venom. But Bane believed that Bruce would be another story because he was just as tough as he was. Nevertheless, as the procedures continued, Alfred went on to express that one of Bane's main responsibilities while working under the Joker was bringing in potential candidates that could be turned into warriors just like him. One of the candidates was somebody regarded as the KG Beast, another one of the candidates was somewhere among the Middle East, and the last candidate he mentioned was none other than Deathstroke himself, who he happened to be very close with at one time. And although none of them were able to survive the full procedure, they were all transformed into something completely new when everything was said and done. After that, the story jumps back over to Santa Prisca, where it's revealed that Bane has some kids and a wife that he visits when he's not doing work for the Joker. It's here that Alfred indicates that Santa Prisca is finally at peace and is also finally thriving, implying that that's what the Joker offered him back when he escaped prison many years ago. And apparently they were trying to offer Bruce the exact same thing by turning him into the warrior that Gotham truly needed, which is when we get the insanely mind-blowing reveal of what Bruce ended up turning into as a result of the procedure in Arc M. But then, as the story comes to a close, we realize that pretty much everything that happened between Bane and Batman in this issue was just Alfred predicting what would happen if Bruce couldn't overcome the obstacle of Bane. So Bruce is still out there somewhere, probably trying to strategize with Killer Croc. However, at the very end of the issue, we see that Bane is trying to draw Bruce out from wherever he's hiding by going after Ozzy, Harvey, and Eddie. So it looks like we might be seeing Absolute Penguin, Absolute Two-Face, and Absolute Riddler very, very soon. But sadly, that's when our issue comes to an end. But if you want to see what happens next with Absolute Batman, let me know in the comments down below.